Eliza Vane, Countess of Rendham, stood in the doorway of her own ballroom and did not move. She did not cry out. She did not reach for the door frame, though her hand wanted it. She did not turn to find her husband's eyes among the crowd and beg them, silently, to explain what she was seeing. Because she already understood, and, understanding, she had learned, required no permission from anyone. Across the polished floor, in the ring of candlelight her own housekeeper had spent 2 days trimming and setting, the Earl of Rendham stood, with his hand at the small of Mrs. Selina Marchmont's back, guiding her through the figures of a dance, as though the guiding were a rite long established. Eliza's fingers found the plain gold ring she wore on a chain beneath her bodice, the one that had been her mother's, and closed around it until the worn engraving pressed a small, familiar pain into her palm. "Tend well what is yours," it said, "and it will not need to be asked twice." She had asked, twice, 3 times, all spring. She would not ask again. By the end of that summer, the county would speak of Eliza Vane the way they spoke of weather that had finally broken after a long, close heat, with relief and a little awe, and no memory at all of how unbearable the stillness had been while it lasted. But that was still ahead of her, on the night the dancing did not stop, and so she turned instead, quietly, and went to find her son. The summer of 1819 had come to Rendham the way it always did, heavy and green and indifferent to the households it moved through, and it had found the Rendham marriage already 5 years old, and already, in the ways that mattered, unattended. Eliza had married Julian Vane the spring she turned 20, when his father, the old Earl, had been alive to arrange it, and the arrangement had been sound in every particular except the one nobody had thought to specify. She brought a working knowledge of accounts learned at her own father's elbow, a dowry respectable rather than dazzling, and a temperament her mother-in-law had once described, not unkindly, as unshakable. Julian brought a title, 11,000 acres spread across 2 counties, and a coldness that everyone attributed to breeding, and nobody, in 5 years, had troubled to attribute to anything else. She had not minded it at first. She had told herself a great many things at first, that reserve was not the same as indifference, that a man raised by a father who measured affection like grain against a bad harvest could not be expected to spend what he had never been taught to keep in store. She had married him knowing this, or nearly knowing it, and she had set herself, quietly and without announcement, to the work of being necessary where she could not yet be loved. It had not been a small work. The Rendham accounts, when she first saw them properly, 3 months into her marriage, were kept in a hand she did not recognise, and arithmetic she did not trust. And it had taken her the better part of a winter, working after the house was asleep, to understand that the steward, before Mr. Ambrose Kettle, had been quietly generous with himself for the better part of a decade. She had corrected it without drama. She had hired Kettle, a bailiff's son with dirt-honest hands and no patience for flattery, and together, over 4 years, they had turned Rendham's outlying farms from a slow bleeding of some £300 a year into a modest, steady profit, and she had never once told her husband the figure, because he had never once asked to see it. She had learned the names of 40 tenant families, and the particular worry that sat behind each one: a roof, a debt, a daughter needing a place, before she had learned whether her husband preferred his tea taken standing or seated. She had borne him a son, Thomas, 6 years old now, and already in the way of children who are watched more than they are spoken to, quieter than his years, and she had raised him largely alone, because Julian Vane's coldness, whatever its cause, extended without prejudice to every soul under his roof, including the one he had made. She had asked him once, in the 2nd year, what it was he wanted from her, precisely, since it plainly was not her company. He had looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she had since learned to call his listening face, which was not the same as his understanding face, and said that he wanted the house run well, and the name kept clean, and that she did both admirably, and that she ought not to trouble herself for more than that. She had not troubled herself after that. Or she had told herself she had not, which she would later recognize as its own kind of arithmetic error. The wound, when it came, did not come as a surprise so much as a bill finally rendered for a debt she had watched accumulate for months. Selina Marchmont had arrived in the county that spring, a widow of good family and better conversation, with a laugh that carried across rooms and a way of touching a man's sleeve that suggested intimacy without ever quite committing to it. She had attached herself to the Rendham circle with the patient warmth of poured cream, and Eliza, who read ledgers for a living, in a manner of speaking, and had therefore learned to read patterns, had watched the arithmetic of her husband's attention shift, week by week, from absent to elsewhere. She had said nothing. She had continued the accounts. She had continued to be, in the word she increasingly hated and could not put down, useful. She was still holding that word, turning it over the way one turns over a coin to check its weight, on the night of the midsummer assembly, when she came down the great stair in a gown of pale green her mother-in-law had once called becoming, and heard, through the half-open door of the small parlor where the older guests took their cards, her husband's voice, pitched low but not low enough, answering a question she had not been meant to hear asked. "Come now, Julian," Selina Marchmont was saying, and there was laughter folded into it, careless and confident. "Does she never wonder? A wife who runs your farms and raises your son and never once asks where you have been of an evening. Does that not seem to you a very particular kind of woman?" "She is not a woman a man loves," Julian said, and his voice had the flatness of a man reading out a column of figures he had already checked twice. "She is a woman a man relies upon. It answers, Selina. That is enough." Eliza stood on the 3rd stair from the bottom with one hand on the rail and did not go down. She did not go down for the length of 11 breaths, which she counted, because counting was a thing she had learned to do with the parts of herself that wanted to shake. Then she went down anyway, because standing on a stair accomplished nothing, and a woman who managed 6 farms and a household of 30 had never yet solved a problem by standing still on it. The assembly proceeded around her for another 2 hours as though nothing at all had happened, which was, she would think later, the particular cruelty of a public wound, that the room does not stop simply because one guest inside it has been quietly gutted. She danced twice with 2 different gentlemen, and gave no sign, and accepted a compliment on the arrangement of the candles, which she had in fact arranged herself, and watched her husband guide Selina Marchmont through a country dance
with his hand resting exactly where a husband's hand rests on a wife, and felt something in her chest close, like a ledger book at the end of a long, bad quarter. It was near midnight when Julian found her in the doorway of the ballroom, not dancing, simply watching, and said, without any particular unkindness, that she looked tired and that she ought to go up. "I am not tired," Eliza said. "I am clear. They are different countries." He did not understand her, which did not surprise her.
He inclined his head, the small, courteous inclination he gave to servants and acquaintances alike, and returned to the floor. And Eliza Vane climbed the stairs to her son's room, sat on the edge of his bed while he slept, and permitted herself exactly as much grief as it took the hourglass on his nursery window-sill to run its sand from top to bottom. Perhaps 7 minutes, no more, before she turned it over, watched the sand begin its patient fall again, and went to find a pen. She had a list to begin. The list, when she had finished it that night, was not long, but it was honest, which was the quality she valued above all others in any document she kept. On one side, she wrote what was truly hers: her mother's ring, £300 of her own income settled at marriage and never touched, the friendship of Mrs. Agnes Coldwell, who had kept house at Rendham for 30 years and called Eliza by her Christian name when no one else was near, the trust of 40 tenant families who did not know her husband's face half so well as they knew hers, and her son. On the other side, she wrote what she had spent 5 years trying to earn, and had that night finally, fully understood she did not have, and would not spend one further hour attempting to earn by other means. She looked at the 2 columns for a long while. Then she closed the book, the way she closed every book once its sum was taken, and went to bed, and did not cry, because crying had already been permitted its 7 minutes, and the account was settled. In the morning she rose before the house, dressed plainly, and walked out to the home farm to find Ambrose Kettle, because a woman who has decided to stop asking to be loved has, as it happens, a very great deal of time suddenly available for other work. Kettle was mending a gate when she found him, a big, slow-spoken man of 40, with hands like paddles, and an honesty that had never once, in 4 years, bent itself to flatter her. He straightened when he saw her coming across the wet grass, and touched his hat, and waited, because he had learned that the Countess generally arrived with a purpose rather than a greeting. "Fenwold," Eliza said, without preamble. "How does it stand?" Kettle considered this. Fenwold was the smaller property, 640 acres of good land some 9 miles distant, which the old Earl had held separately from the entailed Rendham lands, and which had sat undermanaged for 3 years since his death, its rents collected by an agent in Marlstone who took his commission and troubled himself for little else. "Poorly, my lady, if you want it plain," Kettle said. "The Marlow tithe barn wants a new roof. 2 of the tenant leases are running out at Michaelmas, and nobody's told the men whether they'll be renewed, and the agent hasn't been out since March, near as I can tell." "Then I will go out," Eliza said, "and you will come with me, and we will see what 640 acres look like when somebody is finally paying attention to them." Kettle looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not quite surprise, because very little about the Countess surprised him any more, and touched his hat again. "Aye, my lady," he said, "I reckon that's overdue." She had not, until he said it, thought of the word as a verdict on more than a farm. She thought of it that way for the rest of the day, and found she did not mind it.
Fenwold, when she reached it 2 days later in a hired gig with Kettle beside her and a satchel of ledgers on her lap, was not what she had expected. The house itself was modest, a square grey manor with good bones and neglected windows, but the land around it was the kind of land a person who had spent 4 years learning to read soil and drainage could recognize instantly as sound, well-drowned meadow, a stream that had not been allowed to silt, hedgerows kept up by tenants who plainly cared more for the place than its absentee landlord did. She spent the whole of that first day walking it with Kettle, a notebook in her pocket, asking questions of everyone she met, and by evening she had filled 11 pages with the particular stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she is beginning, despite herself, to enjoy.
The Mallow tithe barn, she determined, could be re-roofed for £18 if the timber came from Fenwold's own coppice rather than from Milestone, which the agent had apparently never thought to consider. The 2 lapsing leases belonged to a father and son named Dunn, tenants for 11 years, whom she found mending a fence in the lower field, and who answered her questions with the wary courtesy of men who had been ignored by their landlord's house for so long they no longer expected otherwise.
"We'd stay, my lady, and glad to," the elder Dunn said, turning his hat in his hands, "if somebody'd tell us plain whether we're wanted." "You are wanted," Eliza said. "You will have new leases within the fortnight, at the old rent, not a shilling higher, provided you keep the drainage up on the lower field the way you've kept it this year. I've seen the ditches. They're good work." The old man's face did something complicated, relief arriving late and unpracticed, and he said, "Nobody's looked at those ditches in 3 years, my lady, let alone said so." And Eliza understood, standing in the wet field with her boots sinking slightly into good soil, that she had just been given something she had not received from her own husband in longer than she cared to count. The plain acknowledgement of work seen. She rode back to Rendham that evening with a list 11 pages long and a feeling in her chest she did not immediately recognize because it had been absent for so long. It took her most of the ride home to name it. It was purpose, unaccompanied by hope, which she found she could work with rather better than the reverse. Julian did not ask where she had been. She did not tell him. It was, she thought, the clearest exchange they had managed in a month. She returned to Fenwold 3 times in the following fortnight, and by the end of it, the tithe barn had a new roof of Fenwold timber, the Dunns had their leases, and Kettle had begun, at her direction, a proper rent book kept in a clear hand with every payment dated and every arrear noted honestly rather than smoothed over for the agent's comfort. She paid the roofing carpenter, a taciturn man named Josiah Hale, who worked with 2 boys as apprentices, the full £18 she had promised without haggling, and word of that alone, she would learn later, traveled through Fenwold's 14 tenant families, faster than any letter could have carried it. It was on her 4th visit, in the last week of July, that she met the solicitor. He arrived at Fenwold unannounced, a neat, grey, precise man named Josiah Fenn, who kept an office in Marlstone and had, it transpired, handled the old Earl's private affairs for the better part of 20 years, a fact that had never once been mentioned to Eliza in 5 years of marriage, and which she absorbed with the particular stillness of a woman filing away a fact she suspects will matter later. "I had understood the estate was managed by Mr. Prestwick's office," Eliza said, when he had introduced himself over tea in Fenwold's small, dust-sheeted parlor. "Mr. Prestwick manages the rents, my lady, when he troubles to," Fenn said, with a dryness that suggested his opinion of Mr. Prestwick had been formed some time ago and never revised upward. I manage the settlement. I have, in fact, been meaning to call on Rendham Hall for above a year regarding a paper I hold, but the late Earl was most particular that it not be raised until, his words, my lady, the boy was old enough to matter, and the mother was ready to hear it. I confess I have been waiting to judge the second condition. I believe, having watched you re-roof a barn on your own initiative and renew 2 leases without troubling your husband for permission, that it may finally be met. Eliza set down her cup with both hands, carefully, the way she had learned to set down anything that might otherwise have trembled. "What paper?" she said. "And what does it have to do with my son?" Fenn folded his hands together, the gesture of a man who had rehearsed a difficult announcement more than once in the privacy of his own office. "Fenwold, my lady," he said, "was never part of the Rendham entail. The old Earl held it in fee simple, his to dispose of as he pleased, quite apart from the title. 3 years ago, shortly before his death, he came to my office and had drawn a deed of settlement upon this property, in favour of his first grandson." He paused. "Master Thomas." "Outright, my lady, not in expectancy. The estate passed to the boy the day his grandfather died, held in trust until his majority, the trust to be administered." He glanced down at the paper in his satchel, though Eliza suspected he did not need to. "By his mother, so long as she remains resident and unmarried to any but the boy's father. Not by Lord Rendham, by you." The parlour was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the window, one of Kettle's men was calling to another about a gate. "He gave the running of it to me," Eliza said slowly, "and not to his own son." "He gave it to whoever proved, in his words, to have the sense to tend it," Fenn said. "I believe, forgive me, my lady, I speak as his solicitor and not as a gossip, I believe he had watched his son's temperament rather longer than 5 years, and had drawn certain conclusions about it, and wished to protect the boy's inheritance from any consequence of it. He did not tell you at the time, because he wished the trust proven by your conduct, not claimed by your knowledge of it. I would say, having watched you this fortnight, that it has been proven rather thoroughly already." Eliza sat very still, and did not weep, and did not laugh, though something in her chest was doing both at once, quietly, where it could not be seen. "Does my husband know?" she asked. "He does not," Fenn said. "The deed was never filed for public record. The old Earl's instruction, again, and one I have honoured. It exists in one copy in my office safe, and a second, which I have brought with me today, which I am now placing in your hands, my lady, as its trustee." He drew a folded document from his satchel and set it on the small table between them, and Eliza looked at it the way she had once looked at a ledger with 3 years of quiet theft finely laid open across its pages. Not with triumph, not yet, but with the particular clarity of a woman recognizing, for the first time in a very long while, that she was holding something nobody could take from her by simply declining to notice it. "Thank you, Mr. Fenn," she said, and her voice was entirely steady. "I believe I know exactly what to do with it. Not yet, but I know." She did not tell Julian that night, or the next, or for some weeks after. She told Mrs. Coldwell, because Mrs. Coldwell had earned the telling over 30 years of loyalty that had never once asked anything of Eliza in return. And Mrs. Coldwell, upon hearing it, set down her mending,
looked at Eliza for a long moment, and said only, "Well, that's put the shoe on the proper foot at last, hasn't it?" Which was, from Mrs. Caldwell, very nearly a speech. Eliza folded the deed and locked it in the small travelling desk she kept in her own sitting room, the one Julian had never once opened, and beside it she laid her mother's ring, taken from its chain, because she found, that night, that she no longer wished to carry it hidden against her skin like a secret grief. She wished it kept somewhere it could be reached for on purpose. "Tend well what is yours," the ring said, worn nearly smooth, and for the first time in months, Eliza thought she finally understood the whole of what her mother had meant by it. It was a full month before Julian noticed anything had changed, and when he did, it was not the deed he noticed, he did not yet know of it, but something smaller, and in its way more telling. He came upon her in the estate office at Rendham on a wet afternoon in August, going over Fenwold's new rent book with Kettle, and stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them saw him, watching his wife explain, in a clear, unhurried voice, precisely why the drainage on the lower field justified holding the Dunn's rent steady for another year, despite rising costs elsewhere.
He had never, she would learn later, heard her speak with that particular authority before. He had simply never been in a room where she used it. "I did not know you had taken an interest in Fenwold," he said, when Kettle had gone and they were alone. "You did not ask," Eliza said, without heat, closing the rent book. "I have been managing it for 2 months. It has cost the estate £18 and returned, so far, 40. I imagine Mr. Prestwick will be relieved to be rid of the trouble."
Julian looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed his face that she could not entirely name, not admiration, not yet, but the first thin edge of a man recalculating a sum he had assumed, for years, was already settled. "You manage a great deal," he said, "that I do not see." "Yes," Eliza said, "I do." She did not tell him it was almost the exact sentence Selina Marchmont had used to needle him at the Midsummer Assembly, reframed now as fact rather than accusation. She watched it land anyway, in the small stillness of his jaw, and understood that some part of him had heard the echo, whether she intended it or not. He did not ask about Fenwold again that week, but she noticed, 3 days later, that he had ridden out that direction alone in the morning, and returned by dusk, saying nothing of it, and Eliza, filing the observation away with the same discipline she gave every other fact that might matter later, thought, "That is one." She had begun, without quite deciding to, counting the small signs the way she counted grief, one measured absence noticed, one question not quite asked. It would be a long ladder before it amounted to anything, and she was in no hurry to climb it for him. The county, meanwhile, had begun to speak of her differently, in the slow, half-conscious way a community recalibrates its opinion of a person it has stopped taking for granted. It began at church, where old Sir Robert Hale, the county magistrate, remarked to his wife within Eliza's hearing that the Dunn boys' leases had been the fairest dealing Fenwold had seen in a decade, and continued at the Milestone Market, where a woman Eliza did not know thanked her, unprompted, for the new barn roof, because her husband was one of Hale's apprentices and had been paid fair and on time. It gathered, the way weather gathers, in increments too small to notice individually and impossible to miss in some, and by September, when the harvest began, Eliza Vane was no longer, in the county's quiet accounting, merely the Countess of Rendham. She was the woman who paid what she owed, on time, to the shilling, and meant it. Selina Marchmont noticed the shift before Julian did, which was, in its way, the first sign of the trouble to come. She found Eliza alone in the Rendham Rose Garden in the second week of September, ostensibly admiring the last of the summer blooms, and said, with the particular warmth she reserved for moments she meant to be dangerous, "You have become quite the topic of conversation, Lady Rendham. Barns and leases and rent books. How industrious you have become." "How visible, you mean," Eliza said, not looking up from the rose she was deadheading. "You may say it plainly. I find plain speech saves us both a great deal of time." Something flickered behind Selina's composed face. Not quite alarm, but the first crack in a surface that had, until now, never needed to hold weight. "I only meant," Selina said, "that a woman in your position ought to consider how such industry appears. A wife so occupied with barns might be thought inattentive elsewhere." "I have been inattentive to exactly one thing in 5 years of marriage," Eliza said, straightening, meeting her eyes for the first time. "And it was never Fenwold." She set down her shears. "You may tell my husband, if you like, that I have taken up farming. I imagine he will find it easier to hear from you than from me. He generally does." She left Selina standing among the roses, with an expression that did not entirely recover its warmth for the rest of the afternoon, and walked back toward the house, with the particular lightness of a woman who has, for the first time in a long while, said exactly what she meant, and watched it land precisely where she had aimed it. It was 3 days later that Julian came to her study, not the estate office, but her own private sitting room, which he had entered perhaps 4 times in 5 years, and stood just inside the door with the awkwardness of a man in unfamiliar territory. "Selina tells me you spoke to her sharply," he said. "I spoke to her plainly," Eliza said, not rising from her desk. "There is a difference. I am happy to speak to you the same way, if you would like to sit down." He did not sit. He stood for a long moment, and Eliza watched him with the flat, patient attention of a woman who had spent 5 years learning to read a man who gave almost nothing away, and saw, for the first time, something that might have been discomfort rather than mere coldness. "My father," Julian said abruptly, "was not a warm man." It was not what she had expected, and she said nothing because she had learned that silence, offered correctly, drew more from him than questions ever did. "He measured everything," Julian went on, looking not at her but at the window. "Land, income, obligation. My mother left when I was 9, went to her sisters in Bath and did not come back, and did not send for me, and he told me, the week after, that affection was a poor foundation for anything a man meant to keep. Marry for sense, he said. Love, if it comes, is a bonus paid on a debt already settled. Do not build the house on it." He stopped, started again. "I built the house on it, Eliza. I built the whole of my life on precisely that arithmetic. And I have found this autumn, watching you re-roof a barn without once asking my leave, that the arithmetic does not balance the way I was told it would." Eliza set down her pen. "That is the first true thing you have said to me in 5 years," she said, "and I thank you for it. But an explanation is not an apology, Julian, and you have offered me neither in the correct order. When you are ready to offer both, I will hear them. Until then, I have a rent book to finish." He left without another word, and Eliza sat for some time after the door closed, not working, simply sitting, turning her mother's ring between her fingers, where it now lived on a ribbon at her wrist, rather than hidden beneath her bodice, and thought, with the particular calm of a woman who has just watched the first true crack open in a wall she had assumed was solid stone. That is 2. The forged letter arrived at Rendham on a Thursday in October, carried by the Marlston post and addressed, with careful formality, to the Earl of Rendham personally. Eliza did not see it arrive. She learned of it that evening, when Julian came to her sitting room a second time, twice now in a month, which she noted with the same discipline she noted everything, and set a single sheet of paper on her desk without a word. She read it once, and then again, more slowly, because the second reading was the one that mattered. It purported to be a letter from the old Earl, dated some 4 years past, addressed to a solicitor she did not recognize, expressing his wish that the Fenwold settlement, the very deed Fen had placed in her hands in July, be voided upon any evidence of impropriety on the part of the trustee named therein, and naming, in a hand that mimicked the old Earl's with unsettling care, a specific and scandalous impropriety, an implied liaison between Lady Rendham and her own steward, Mr. Ambrose Kettle, conducted, the letter suggested, under cover of the Fenwold visits. Eliza set the paper down with both hands, steady, and looked up. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "It was sent to me," Julian said, "anonymously, but it references a settlement I did not know existed, Eliza, upon our son, administered by you. Is that true?" "It is true," Eliza said. "Your father made it 3 years ago. Mr. Fen placed the deed in my hands in July, precisely because your father wished it proven by conduct before it was claimed by knowledge. I have the original. I would ask you to compare its hand to whatever hand produced that." She nodded at the letter. "I do not believe they will match." Julian was quiet for a moment. "And Kettle?" he said. "Ambrose Kettle has a wife and 3 children in the cottage below the home farm, and has ridden beside me to Fenwold exactly 11 times since July, always in daylight, always in company of at least one tenant or another," Eliza said. "If you wish to ask him yourself, he is a truthful man and will tell you so without flinching, because it is the truth. I would ask you, Julian, before you decide what to believe, to consider who benefits from your believing this instead." She watched him consider it, watched the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he disliked, weighing a wife's 5 years of demonstrated honesty against a stranger's anonymous claim. And she did not press him further, because she had learned, this autumn, that the pressing was no longer entirely necessary. He was, however slowly, beginning to do the sum himself. "I do not believe it," he said finally. "I do not know yet who sent it, but I do not believe it." "Then find out who did," Eliza said. "I have my own suspicions, and I imagine you share them. But I will not accuse a guest under this roof without proof in hand. I deal in documents, Julian, not in guesses. Proof, when I have it, will keep." She did not sleep well that night, though she permitted herself no more than her 7 measured minutes to mind it. And in the morning she sent a note to Josiah Fen in Marlstone, asking him to call at his earliest convenience, and a second note to Ambrose Kettle, asking him to say nothing to anyone of the letter until she had spoken with him directly. The county's tide had begun to turn in her favour over the autumn, gently, the way water finds a new course. She did not intend to let one forged page turn it back. Fen arrived within 2 days, examined the letter for the better part of an hour with a jeweller's glass borrowed from the milestone clockmaker, and confirmed, precisely as Eliza had expected, that the hand was a careful but ultimately flawed imitation. The old Earl, he said, had crossed his sevens in a particular continental fashion learned in his youth abroad, a habit the forger had not troubled to notice or had not known to look for. Whoever wrote this, Fenn said, had seen the old Earl's hand somewhere, a note, a letter, something kept and studied, but had not seen enough of it. This was not written by a stranger to this house, my lady. This was written by someone who has been inside it. Eliza thought of Selina Marchmont's easy familiarity with Rendham's library, her habit of borrowing books and returning them late, her long afternoons in the morning room, where the old Earl's correspondence had, until recently, been kept in an unlocked cabinet, and said nothing of her suspicion aloud. Not yet. Because a suspicion was not a document, and she had learned, over 5 years and one very long autumn, exactly how much a document was worth against a mere accusation. "I will need the original of my father-in-law's hand," she said instead, "and I will need you present, Mr. Fenn, at whatever gathering I use to settle this. I do not intend to settle it quietly." Fenn studied her for a moment, with something that might, in a less precise man, have been approval. "No," he said, "I did not imagine you would." It took 3 weeks to gather what she needed, and Eliza spent them with the particular patience of a woman who has learned that a document assembled too quickly rarely holds under pressure. She wrote to her mother-in-law's former lady's maid, now retired to a cottage near Bath, who confirmed in a careful letter that Mrs. Marchmont had, the previous spring, borrowed and copied several of the old Earl's letters from the Rendham Library, under the pretence of admiring his hand for her own correspondence album, a detail so small and so plausible that no one at the time had thought twice of it. She obtained, through Fenn, a sworn statement from a milestone clerk named Peter Loach, employed by the very solicitor named as recipient in the forged letter, who confessed, white-faced and shaking, that he had been paid 4 guineas by a lady he now identified, upon being shown a miniature, as Mrs.
Selina Marchmont, to write out a letter from dictation and age the paper over a candle flame, and that he had believed, or told himself he believed, it to be a harmless jest. She kept every document in the small travelling desk beside her mother's ring, and she told no one but Fenn, Kettle, and Mrs. Coldwell the full shape of what she had assembled, because she had learned, this autumn above all others, that a case revealed too early gave its target time to build a second lie to answer the first. Selina Marchmont's counterstroke came on the last Sunday of October, at the Rendham harvest gathering, the one occasion each year when tenants from both estates, county gentry, and the household staff assembled together on the lawn before the hall, and which Eliza had, until that autumn, always organized quietly and attended without particular notice. This year she meant it to be different. She had told Julian only that she wished the gathering held as usual, with one addition, that Mr. Fenn be invited to speak briefly on the subject of the Fenwold accounts, for the tenants' satisfaction. Julian, still turning over his own private arithmetic, had agreed without asking why. Selina Marchmont, sensing perhaps that the ground beneath her had begun to shift in ways she did not yet fully understand, arrived at the gathering with a final card of her own, and played it before the assembled crowd with the bright, confident ease of a woman who had never once been made to answer for anything in her life. "Lord Rendham," she said, loudly enough to draw the nearby guests as the trestle tables were being cleared after the meal. "I wonder that you allow your countess so free a hand with Fenwold, given the letter that came to you not a month past. I should have thought a man in your position would wish the matter settled quietly, rather than risk further talk." She let the words sit, delicately poisoned. "Unless, of course, you have already decided which of us you believe." The lawn went, in the space of that sentence, very quiet, the particular quiet of a crowd that senses a private matter has just been made public, and does not yet know whether to look away or lean in. Eliza Vane set down the cup of cider she had been holding, with both hands gently, and stepped forward. "I am glad you raised it here, Mrs. Marchmont," she said, and her voice, pitched to carry without rising, reached every corner of the lawn. "Because I have, in fact, settled it. Mr. Fenn?" The solicitor stepped forward from where he had been waiting, unobtrusive at the edge of the gathering, a leather case in hand, and Eliza watched the color begin, very slightly, to leave Selina Marchmont's face. "3 weeks ago," Eliza said, addressing the lawn now, tenants and gentry alike, in the same plain, unhurried voice she used for rent books, "a letter arrived at this house, purporting to be written by the late Earl, questioning my conduct and my fitness to administer a trust he left to my son. I did not answer it with anger, because anger answers nothing. I answered it with inquiry. Mr. Fenn, would you show them what you found?" Fenn opened his case and held up, side by side, the forged letter and a genuine sample of the old Earl's hand, and explained, in the dry, precise tones of a man who had spent 30 years making complicated things simple for juries and magistrates alike, the matter of the Continental Sevens, a detail so small and so damning that a murmur ran through the crowd the moment he pointed it out. "I would not ask this county to take my word for a forgery," Eliza said, into the murmur, "when I can offer proof instead." She nodded, and Peter Loach, pale and sweating in his good coat, stepped forward from where Fenn had quietly seated him among the tenant benches, and in a voice that shook only slightly, confirmed before the assembled crowd that he had written the letter at Mrs. Marchmont's dictation, for 4 guineas, and aged the paper himself. Selina Marchmont's composure, which had weathered a good deal that autumn, did not survive this. Something behind her carefully arranged face simply went out, the way a candle goes out when the wick is finally spent, and she looked, for one unguarded moment, not like a dangerous woman at all, but like a person who has run out of paper to spend. "This is absurd," she said, but her voice had lost its warmth, and the lawn, Eliza noted with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching a tide finally turn all the way, did not believe her. Old Mr. Dunn, standing near the back with his son beside him, said loud enough to carry, "I'll testify the Countess paid me fair to the day, same as she does every soul in that farm, and never once asked a thing of me she didn't pay honest for." And the murmur that followed was not for Selina Marchmont at all. "I could have brought this to a magistrate," Eliza said when the lawn had quieted again, and she let the words land slowly, because she meant every one of them to be heard. "I could have had Mrs. Marchmont answer for forgery before Sir Robert Hale, and I do not doubt what the answer would have found. I have chosen not to. I have chosen, instead, to say this plainly, before everyone she has tried to turn against me, and let that be the whole of her punishment, that everyone here now knows precisely what she is capable of, and precisely what I am not.
Mrs. Marchmont, I would ask you to leave Rendham within the week. I will not have you removed by force, because I do not need to. Your welcome has simply ended." Selina Marchmont looked for a long moment at Julian, who stood very still at the edge of the gathering with an expression Eliza had genuinely never seen on his face before. Something between shame and a dawning, unwilling respect, and found, evidently, nothing there to save her. "You will regret this," Selina said to Eliza, low, before she turned to go. But the words had no weight behind them any more, and both women knew it. "I regret very little I have done honestly," Eliza said. "I find that is one of the advantages of doing things honestly in the first place." The lawn watched Selina Marchmont walk to her carriage alone, and Eliza Vane did not watch her go. She turned instead to Mr. Dunn, and to the roofing carpenter Josiah Hale, and to the dozen other tenants who had come forward, unbidden, in the last quarter hour, to say some plain version of the same thing, and thanked each of them by name, because she had learned their names properly, and it cost her nothing at all to use them. Julian found her an hour later, when the gathering had begun to disperse, and the last light was going gold and low over the stubbled fields, standing alone near the empty trestle tables, with her mother's ring turning slowly between her fingers. "You might have told me," he said. "Before today, I would have stood beside you." "You might have asked," Eliza said, not unkindly, "at any point in the last 5 years, what I was carrying alone. I did not tell you because I have learned, this autumn, that I no longer need your standing beside me to carry what is mine. I managed it. I am glad, today, that it worked out well for both of us, but I did not need you for it, Julian, and I think that is the thing you actually came out here to ask me, underneath the other question." He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had heard it in years. "I would like the chance," he said, "to be needed for something other than standing beside you after the fact. I do not know if I have earned the asking, but I am asking." "Then we will see," Eliza said, "what you do with it," and left him standing among the emptying tables while she went to find her son, because Thomas had watched the whole of the gathering from Mrs. Coldwell's side, wide-eyed and silent, and she thought he had, perhaps, earned an explanation more than his father had that day. The full explanation, when Julian finally gave it, came 3 evenings later in Eliza's sitting room, with the door closed and no one else present, and it took him the better part of an hour because he did it properly, without shortening it for his own comfort. He told her of his mother's leaving, in more detail than he had ever given before. How she had written once, 6 months after Bath, and how his father had burned the letter unread in front of him, and told him that a Vane did not chase what had already chosen to go. He told her of the years after, of learning to want nothing visibly, because visible wanting had cost his father a wife, and cost him, he now understood, very nearly everything else besides. He told her that when his father had proposed the match with her, he had asked, in the only moment of doubt he permitted himself before the wedding, whether he ought to love her. And his father had said that love was a bonus paid on a debt already settled, and that a sensible man secured the settlement first. He told her that he had believed it, entirely, for 5 years, and that Selina Marchmont had cost him nothing to be near, precisely because she had asked nothing real of him, and that Eliza had frightened him from the very first year of their marriage, because everything about her had asked, silently, for something he did not believe he knew how to give. "That is the explanation," Eliza said when he had finished, "and I thank you for the whole of it, because I believe it is true, and truth costs a man like you more than most. But an explanation is not an apology, Julian. You have told me why. You have not yet told me you are sorry, in words that name what you did, rather than what your father did to you first." He was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry," he said. "I let a woman insult you in your own home for a season, and called it not noticing. I chose the appearance of being wanted by someone easy over the substance of being known by someone real, because the substance frightened me, and the appearance did not. I am sorry, Eliza, not for my father's arithmetic, for my own." "All right," Eliza said. "All right," he said, and there was something almost raw in the question. "All right, then," Eliza said, and something in her chest, which had been closed like a ledger for a very long time, opened by perhaps one careful page. "That is not forgiveness, Julian. That is the door left unlocked. What you do with the unlocked door is the whole of what I will judge you by from here." She had her terms ready because she had been drafting them in the private ledger of her mind since the night of the Midsummer Assembly, and she gave them to him now, plainly, the way she gave every account. "I will keep the Fenwold Trust in my own name until Thomas comes of age, exactly as your father intended, and you will not contest it," she said. "I will keep my own income, and I will keep Ambrose Kettle as my steward there, and you will not question either again without cause. I will not be paraded before this county a second time, in any fashion, by any woman, without answering it the same day I choose, not the day it is convenient to you. And I will not be mediated to, Julian, not through a solicitor, not through a note left on a desk. If you have something to say to me, you will say it to my face, the way you have said this." "All right," Julian said. "All right, then," Eliza said, and something in the room, which had held its breath in one fashion or another since the night of the summer assembly, seemed, very quietly, to exhale. Winter came to Rendham that year the way it comes to a house finally being repaired, slow, unglamorous, full of small, unfinished tasks that add up, in time, to something whole. Eliza did not expect grand gestures, and Julian, to his credit, did not offer them. He offered instead the kind of proof she had told him, months before, was the only kind she trusted. Ordinary days repeated. He began riding out to Fenwold with her, not to direct, but to learn, standing silent and attentive beside Kettle while the steward explained drainage and rents in the same plain terms he used with Eliza. And by December, he could read a rent book competently enough to catch, unprompted, an error the Marlstone agent had left uncorrected for 2 years.
He began without being asked, moving his chair at dinner from the head of the table nearer to hers, a distance of perhaps 4 feet that took him 3 separate evenings to close, 1 foot at a time, as though testing whether the ground would hold. He began pouring her tea before she reached for the pot herself, a small thing, entirely wordless, which she noted the first time with mild surprise, and by the fifth time, with the beginning of something she had almost forgotten how to feel toward him. None of it, alone, would have meant anything. Eliza told herself that plainly, each time, because she had learned to distrust single gestures the way she distrusted a single figure in an unaudited account. It was the accumulation that mattered. The chair moved, the tea poured, the ledger shared, the questions finally asked instead of assumed, and by February, when the accumulation had run to some 40 small, unremarkable days, she found she had begun, without quite deciding to, believing in the sum of them. The relapse came in March, as she had privately expected it might, because a man does not unlearn 9 years of his father's arithmetic in a single winter, without at least one slip back into the old sums. A dispute arose over a boundary hedge between Fenwold and a neighboring freeholder, a minor matter that nonetheless touched Thomas's trust, and Julian, without consulting her, rode to Marlstone alone and settled it directly with the freeholder's own solicitor, signing an agreement on the estate's behalf before Eliza had even heard the dispute existed. She confronted him that evening, not with anger, but with the flat clarity she had always used, because she had learned that clarity did more work than heat ever had. "You signed a paper concerning Thomas's land without consulting his trustee," she said. "I understand why you did it. Old habit reaches for the pen before it thinks. But I told you, in October, that I would not be mediated to. This was mediation, Julian, however well you meant it." He did not argue, and he did not retreat into wounded silence, which she noted this time as its own small proof. "You are right," he said. "I did it because it was faster, and because some old part of me still believes settling things quickly, alone, is what a man of my position does. I will have the agreement amended tomorrow to bear your signature as trustee where it belongs, and I will not do it again. Tell me plainly if I do." "I will," Eliza said, and found, watching him absorb the correction without flinching from it, that the relapse had cost her less than she had feared, and proven him more than either of them had expected. It was on a quiet evening in April, nearly a year from the night of the Midsummer Assembly, that Julian said the thing she had, by then, stopped waiting to hear, because she had found she no longer needed it in order to be whole. They were in her sitting room, the small traveling desk open between them, going over the spring accounts together, a habit now rather than an occasion, when he set down his pen and said, without any particular ceremony, "I would choose you. I have been choosing you, I think, since October, in every small way I know how, but I have not said it plainly, and you have taught me this year that plain is the only kind of saying that matters. I would choose you, Eliza. I have been choosing you for some time. I intend to go on doing it for the rest of my life, in ordinary days, the way you have taught me love is actually kept." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and did not answer immediately, because she had learned, this year above all others, the value of an unhurried reply. "Then we are agreed," she said finally. "We are agreed," Julian said, and something in his face, which had spent 9 years learning not to want anything visibly, allowed itself, at last, to want this visibly, entirely, without flinching from what it cost. She reached across the small desk and took his hand, and did not let go. And outside the window the last of the winter's cold was finally, fully breaking,
the way it always did eventually, for households willing to do the slow work of thawing it. 2 years passed, counted the way Eliza counted most things now, in ledgers, in seasons, in the small, honest sums of ordinary days.
Fenwold's income had nearly doubled by the second harvest, and the fair wages Eliza had begun there, paid on time, to the shilling, no exceptions made for convenience, had become so well known through the county that tenants from other estates asked, only half in jest, whether Lady Rendham might be persuaded to take on their landlord's books as well. She had not. She had, instead, begun teaching Kettle's eldest daughter, a sharp, quiet girl named Susan with a gift for figures, to keep accounts properly, the first of what Eliza intended to be a small, ongoing line of girls in the county, taught a trade their fathers had never thought to offer them. Susan kept the Fenwold books herself now, under Eliza's oversight, and signed them in a clear, careful hand that Eliza privately thought her own mother would have approved of. Thomas, 8 years old and growing tall, rode out to Fenwold with his father most Saturdays now, and had begun, at his own insistence, keeping a small notebook of his own observations about the drainage and the hedgerows, in a hand that still wandered, but a mind that plainly did not. He would inherit the estate outright at 21, but Eliza suspected, watching him crouch beside Kettle to examine a ditch with the same serious attention his mother gave to every account she had ever kept, that he would not need to wait that long to understand what it meant to tend something well. Selina Marchmont, it was learned some months after her departure, had settled in Bath, of all places, and married a widowed merchant of modest means, who knew nothing of forged letters and, so far as anyone in the county could discover, never would. Eliza thought of her rarely, and without much heat, which she considered, on reflection, the truest measure of how thoroughly that particular ledger had been closed. Julian wore, these days, a plain gold band on his smallest finger, worn beside his signet rather than in its place, fashioned by the Marlstone jeweler to match, as closely as such things could be matched, the worn engraving of Eliza's mother's ring. He had asked the jeweler to inscribe it with the same words, and had given it to her one evening in the second spring, not as a replacement for anything, but as a companion piece, and told her that he wanted, from now on, to wear the same motto she had carried alone for so many years, because he intended to spend the rest of his life proving he had finally learned to read it. "You are not what I bargained for," he said to her once, that second spring, half in memory of the very words Selina had once flung at her in the rose garden, though Eliza had never repeated them to him, and never learned exactly how he had come to know them. The county carried such things, in the end, the way water carries silt, quietly, until it settles somewhere useful. He said it slowly, watching her across the estate office, where she sat with Susan's ledgers and Thomas's notebook, and the small, ordinary business of a life fully hers. "You are not what I bargained for," he said again. "You are what I would beg for, if begging were still required. I am glad, every day, that it is not." The house at Rendham, by that second spring, had a particular quality to it that visitors sometimes remarked upon without quite being able to name, a kind of ease in its rooms, doors left open that had once stood permanently closed, a countess's voice heard laughing, actually laughing, in the estate office some afternoons, a sound the older servants said they had not heard in all the years of the marriage before. Mrs. Coldwell, asked once by a visiting cousin what precisely had changed, considered the question for a long moment, and said only that the house had finally learned to breathe, and left it at that, because some things, in her long experience,
did not improve for being explained twice. Eliza Vane had spent a great many years being useful before she was ever loved. And she had learned in the process a thing she never once said aloud to her husband, because she found she did not need to. That being needed is not the same as being loved. And a woman who waits to be told the difference will wait a very long time. But a woman who builds her own ground to stand on need not wait at all. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not through anger, not through ruin, but through the slow, plain, honest accumulation of work done well and accounts kept true, until the whole county and, at last, her own husband could no longer look at Rendham or at Finwold or at the woman who had quietly built both into something worth having, without seeing exactly what she had always been. Not an asset entered on a ledger, not a debt settled for convenience. A woman who had tended what was hers, and had not, in the end, needed to be asked twice.